want to highlight a couple of things that happens when one stops abiding in God, how you can come back to God, because all hope is lost and God never gives up on anyone. Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Vivian and I make faith-based videos to equip you in your walk with God. And if you're not new, welcome back to the family. Thank you so much guys for your support and for your love on this channel. I hope that you've been doing so well. God has been so good. So I just brought this video blesses you. I was doing some Bible study the other day, and so I wanted to show you guys what I was learning. And so as you can see from the title already, it's to do with the story of the prodigal son. Now, I wanted to use that story to explain more on the dangers of not abiding in God. As we know, abiding in God means to stay in Him, to remain in His presence, to walk with Him daily, constantly and consistently. When one stops abiding in God, a lot of different things happen. There are a lot of signs as well that show in your life that you've stopped abiding, that you've stopped having communion with God. And one danger of not abiding, of not being in God's presence, is the fact that one becomes much more susceptible to sin. When you're out of the presence of God, you become an easy prey to the enemy. We must know that when you get saved, the enemy is always constantly going to look for ways to pull you back into the world, to pull you back into what God has saved you from. As you can see the story of the Israelites, after God delivered them from Egypt, they still had that desire to go back. And that's the case with so many of us now. When God has saved us, there's always the battle for your soul. There's always a battle for your soul to remain with God, because the enemy isn't happy that God has saved you. The enemy isn't happy that God has delivered you from whatever held you bound before. So it's good to have that knowledge, to have the understanding of the utmost importance of staying in God, of staying with God, and of having an active prayer life, an active Bible study, an active communion with God, an active relationship with Him, because when that begins to decline, then it's just downwards from there. But the important thing is seeking to go back to His arms, seeking to go back and staying and remaining in Him. Okay, let me read you this part of the story. It's in Luke 15, verse 17 says, "And when he came to himself, he said, 'How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee.'" And then he started making his way back to his father. So I want to highlight two things there. When he came to his senses, simply means that eyes were opened. His mind became opened to a reality of something like, wait, hold on. What am I doing? And that is what happens when one goes away from the presence of God. The understanding becomes darkened. The light that you once had when you were with God, the light that only God provides, fades away until it diminishes. And also because of the hardening effect that sin has on our heart as well, the farther and farther away you go from God, the worse it gets. And the truth is, anyone who's lost in sin isn't really themselves. The Bible tells us that in Ephesians 2 that you were once dead in your trespasses. You're once dead, and He is now quickened. Now, who does the work of quickening us? It is the Holy Spirit. He quickens you. That means He gives life to you. And this is what happened to the prodigal son. He came to his senses. Know this, it is by God's grace and God's grace alone that we are saved. The fact that he came back to his senses was an act of God's mercy, an act of God's grace, and it was the Holy Spirit that was drawing him back. I'm simply saying that being found by God, being saved by Him, is a work of His grace and evidence of His love. So in the ending of this chapter, his father says this: It was necessary that we make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. It reminded me of the part in the Bible in Ephesians 5:14 where it says, "Awake, O you sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." We talked about earlier, is the Holy Spirit that gives that quickening effect on your mind, your body. Like when you're lost, when you're far from God, the Holy Spirit can quicken you once again, that means you're now awake. So what next do you need? How are you going to find your way back to God? You need the light. And that is what the prodigal son did. He said, I will arise and go back to my father after he came to his senses. So you have to first come back to your senses first through the help of the Holy Spirit. And then Christ gives you a light that will direct you back to the presence of God. Because if you walked away from his presence of God, it's not going to be automatically the same as it was before. You still have to be directed back to God. You still have to do some walking to catch up to where you left off. I hope that makes sense so far. So the point of this is to say that we need to abide in God, and when we don't, there's a danger of falling away, as the Bible warns us so many times. And just remaining in God is the only safe place. Just as Noah and his family were safe as long as they remain in the ark, we also need to remain in God constantly. It's warned in John 15 that he who doesn't remain in him, whoever doesn't remain in him, that person will wither and that person will be cut away. That includes being cut away from the life of God, being cut away from the presence of God. Fellowship with God is cut off, and that is so not good. It's so not good, because the person's life can only go downwards from there. Because remember, we are nothing without God. We need him every day of our lives, now and in the future. We're always going to need God. I hope this video has shed some light on that. I thought that was interesting, the process of the prodigal son coming back to the father, just to give you hope and encouragement that God does not give up and will not give up on you. So thank you guys for watching. Even if this doesn't relate to you, you could share this with somebody who you know might be struggling in their walk with God. And it's also just good for us to know, so that we know the dangers, so we know things to avoid, and also to help other people in their walk. Thank you so much for watching, and stay blessed.